Hey, everybody. Welcome today to the CMMC War Room. Now, this is a brand new series, and I know people are going to trickle in, so we'll let them do that. But this is a brand new series that we really spent a lot of time thinking about. How do we get outside of the echo chamber? We've got a lot of participation, and I'm very grateful for the stakeholders within the ecosystem that have been very active. But what tends to happen is that we tend to sort of see each other, which is great because that camaraderie is excellent. But we want to reach out to those organizations out there who don't have their finger on the pulse of every single little detail and who need to know about some of the critical fundamentals from the experts and decision makers out here within the CMMC ecosystem, and gain information and knowledge that they can trust and that's reliable, and so that they can make good decisions about where they're at and where they need to be. So the CMMC War Room is to bring up those topics. It's going to be monthly, and that is going to be a sister webinar to our CMMC Mythbusters training education series, which is a 6-part series, and that we'll do starting on February 28th. Now, I want to, before we introduce our guest today, I want to recognize some of the fantastic work that Regan has done. Regan is open for business, and they went through the Joint Surveillance Program, the DFARS High, in coordination with Redspin, who did a fantastic job. And they are qualified for certification underneath the Joint Surveillance Program. That's going to happen, after the rule is released and so on and so forth. But the reality is that they put in a lot of hard work. The assessment was over 4 days, and it took them about 24 months to get their house in order. And now they sit at a 110 score. So kudos to Regan. They are open for business, and if you're choosing a supplier within the DoD, you should definitely choose Regan because they will be a good steward of your data. Secondly, we're going to talk about and introduce our guest today. So we'll talk to Matt Titcombe, who is an outstanding expert within this field and one of the absolute best. And we'll also talk to Matt Travis, who is the CEO of the Cyber AB board, and he'll tell you a little bit about that mission and a little bit about their purpose. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And we're going to spend the next hour ripping and roaring within the CMMC War Room. So as you can imagine, I, as a former Ranger, take war pretty seriously. And so that's how we got the idea, and we are grateful for that. So, Matt, let's talk about with you, and let's talk about the mission of the AB, and then sort of start walking down some questions.
Hey, thanks, Regan. Good to be with you and Matt, and great for everyone to join the webinar. And I echo your desire to step outside the usual CMMC usual suspects. So hopefully we have some new folks here. And because of that, let me just talk a bit about the Cyber AB. We are the CMMC accreditation body. And we are the nonprofit 501c3 tax-exempt organization that has the exclusive relationship with the Department of Defense to accredit, certify, oversee the implementation of the CMMC ecosystem. So it's a position that is certainly one of privilege, being that we are the partners, the non-governmental partners with DoD to ensure that CMMC is executed with impartiality, consistency, objectivity, and ultimately success for all involved. And we work hand in hand with DoD to continue to build out this ecosystem. So great to be with you.
Well, thank you, Matt. So let's talk about the update on the CMMC rule. I know that the people who are tuned into this are, sort of biting at every detail. But I also know that some of the folks out there that we really want to meet are sort of don't really understand, DFARS 7012. And we'll talk about that with Matt Titcombe too, of course. But if you could talk about sort of the difference, right? And what the purpose of the CMMC certification is, and then what's the process that we're going through here with the upcoming CMMC rule?
Sure. And I'll once again just remind everyone that what I'm talking about here and throughout the webinar, we are an independent entity. I'm not speaking for the Department of Defense or the U.S. government. So my update on rulemaking is basically what I'm gleaning as a member of the public from what has been published and what I understand what DoD has talked about. So in a nutshell, when Congress creates laws, the executive branch executes those laws. But sometimes Congress gives broader authorities to departments and agencies. And when those departments and agencies want to do some specific things, especially under the regulatory nature, they have to go through rulemaking. And the purpose of rulemaking is to ensure that due diligence and public comment are all enabled and that coordination with the federal government is achieved before a rule goes public, because rules don't go through the same process that Congress does to pass a public law. And so rulemaking is ensured that the Administrative Procedures Act is followed. So where is the CMMC rules? And there are two rules. One of the things that's important to recognize about CMMC is that the department, I think, has really signaled their commitment long-term to supply chain security by creating a Title 32 rule as well as a Title 48 rule. I won't get too arcane, but CMMC 1.0 really is dealt with just the Title 48 rule, which is the procurement part of the Code of Federal Regulations, deals with government contracting, right? So when CMMC 2.0 came around, DoD wanted to really double down on anchoring CMMC as part of our national defense policy. So Title 32 is the part of CFR that deals with national defense. So just like aircraft carrier programs and other DoD programs, CMMC will be ensconced in defense policy through the Title 32 rule. So both of those rules are going through rulemaking in parallel. What we look for in terms of, and you kind of hit on this, what are the timelines? So where are we? The department's been working on drafting that rule language for the better part of a year now. That rule still hasn't left the building because they've got to coordinate it. So offices within the Pentagon, they've got to get a chance to chop on it. Small business office, general counsel's office, the Air Force, the Navy. And if they want additional language entered, or if they want to change language, or they object to language, then they file their non-concur. And so all those non-concurs have to be coordinated before the rules can leave the building. And when the rules leave the Pentagon, they'll go to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, or OIRA, up at OMB within the White House complex. And there they've got 90 days by law to review those rules. And after they do that, they will publish them. And then a public comment period will ensue, about 60 days. And then depending on the designation that those rules get, the rule can either, we've got to go through all the adjudication of those public comments that can take, up to a year or more. Or if it gets an interim designation, kind of like the fast track status, then that rule can actually be implemented and operationalized while public comments are adjudicated. Right now, the CMMC rules do not have that designation, though that could change. And so we're still looking at a pretty good, at least a year or so before the CMMC rules will be operational.
Okay, so if DFARS 7012, if we have that now, 252, 204, 7012 as a contract clause, right? For prime contractors and all of their suppliers that are receive CUI in performance of their contracts, or develop CUI in performance of the contract. If we have that, then what makes the CMMC rule so important? Why is it important and distinct from just having the DFARS 7012 as we have now?
Sure, yeah, and 7012 is in effect, and many of you out there with contracts, prime or sub, may likely have those clauses, and you're required by the 7012 clause to implement what is de facto the NIST, or the CMMC standard, which is NIST 800-171. What the CMMC rules do is give the authority for the department through CMMC to have third-party validation of the implementation of NIST 800-171. So that 7012 clause requires you to implement 800-171. There are other clauses that followed from the DFARS 19 clause that required those companies now to report your own self-assessment scores against that standard. And the 20 clause came along that gives DoD the right to access your environment, to do spot checks, DIBCAC high, DIBCAC moderate. The 21 rule is where you get to CMMC, which is not yet operational. So the 7012 clause, if you've got it, you are already on the hook to implement the practices of NIST 800-171. Okay,
all right, perfect. Then that makes sense. So that relationship in the schedule is essentially I'm at risk now, right? Underneath the 7012 and 7019 and 7020, correct?
You certainly are required by the contract you have signed to implement the practices of NIST 800-171, and you are now at risk for being called on that, both from if you're reporting false scores in SPRS, or if the DIBCAC comes knocking to take a look and you've not implemented, then your contract's at risk. And if you follow, Regan, some of the attorneys who follow CMMC, you're hearing more references to the False Claims Act and
Right.
DOJ task forces. And so those aren't scare tactics necessarily. It's just the reality of the department has certainly signaled its commitment to enforcing cybersecurity requirements. And while CMMC is going through rulemaking, that does not obviate the mechanisms they have outside of CMMC to enforce those requirements.
Okay. All right. That makes perfect sense. All right. With that, I think that's a good transition to Matt Titcombe. Now, I got to tell you, there are very few people that I call a friend and admire their expertise, and Matt is definitely one of them. And we have been in the fight literally since almost the very first day working in the on the AB Board's Standards Industry Working Group. And Matt, Peak InfoSec. I mean, tell me about the relationship of what Matt Travis said about how important is the 7012 and 7019 and 7020, and how does that impact me as a small mid-sized business out there right now, and what are my obligations underneath that and contract eligibility?
So I'm going to go to the very end, 7020, the very end of 7020. There's a clause in there, which is the flow down clause, that basically says that prime or that tier one is required to validate that anybody they're flowing this down to has implemented 800.171, or they're not allowed to award a contract to them.
Okay.
So this is the trickle down from that prime all the way down to that mom and pop shop who's building a widget for the F-22, and that widget is CUI because they get a spec for it and they've got to mill it.
Does it matter how big I am or how small I am?
Nope. We've got clients in Boston that are six people.
Okay.
And they're handling some very interesting CUI. Got a client that is doing tapeworm analysis at a university. Tapeworms are CUI, by the way. Weird use case, but it is a true one. So they can happen in all types of forms and format. And that one blew my mind, by the way, too. So yeah, if you're involved in a DoD contract and we think technical information design, but if you're handling, personal information, if you're handling, the DoD's financial information for the credit card, that's CUI also.
Okay.
So a lot of times it's a lot broader than people want to realize.
All right. So am I eligible? Let's say I'm really hearing this for the first time, or I heard a little bit about it, and occasionally I get an email and this and that. And, some of our clients get, 200-page questionnaire. I don't really know how to answer them, right? I pretty much click yes in every box because I obviously want the business. But am I at risk for contract eligibility right now if I haven't done these things, or if I don't have an SPRS score?
This is a fuzzy one. So non-lawyer hat. Unfortunately, I've ran into companies that have said, yeah, we're just whitewashing that and we're not doing anything until something rolls out, which is really the wrong way to do it, because when it does roll out and suddenly you've got to get certified, your time shrunk and your costs just spiraled up.
Right.
When that happens, and what we're starting to see going back to that trickle down of showing proof, primes and the major contractors are asking for proof that you've submitted your score in SPRS, the supplier performance risk system. They're asking for copies of your system security plan. Suddenly, if you don't have those, sorry to use an old cliche, the way I explain this to people, this is like being the cool kids in the front of the bus. Then once they figure out you're not doing this, you're moving to the very front of the bus and nobody wants to play with you anymore. And what you're going to find is you're just going to start to be excluded or get smaller and smaller parts lower down the chain, which means less and less profit. Yeah. And the real goal in DoD supply chain is to get to the top of that supply chain.
So we've had instances in our clients who they started getting squeezed a bit. They started on, DFARS. They got lost track of it, which is pretty typical, right? And then all of a sudden they started getting squeezed a bit. And then they realized that they're not really sure that what they've done has been accurate or consistent with the requirements. Have you had that experience where somebody's checking on their SPS score and they really, when the DCMA started talking about sufficient evidence and things that started making them nervous about their score. It just wasn't, hey, Bob, how do you think we did on access control? It's like, yeah, we're good, right? But when they started speaking about sufficient evidence, they started getting nervous and then realized that how they thought they met requirements really wasn't accurate or consistent with the requirements. Have you had that experience?
Yes. What we see is there's two core issues driving behind this. One, when it comes to get ready, DIBCAC or us as an authorized C3PO coming in, we're going to evaluate you at not the 110 requirements, but the 320 assessment objectives against all of the components in scope.
Okay.
So again, this is where if you're not getting all the hidden requirements now, the assessment objective level against all of your components, we find that out and your SPRS score goes down, your POAMs go up, and just badness happens. The other thing we find is it's the nuance, and everybody, FIPS, whatever you want to talk, there's a lot of nuance and definitions and relationships in 800, 171, 171 alpha and CMMC that a lot of times the way I explain this to people is when we come in as a third party, we don't come in with your preconceived notion of the way you work. And many times the way I explain to clients is you're too close to the bark to see the tree that's in the forest that's on the mountain.
Right.
We're the ones starting all the way out here, the mountain view, and we're going to see all the gaps and patches in your forest because now we're coming in with a third party perspective. It causes a lot of, as we refer to it as the CMMC 7 stages of grief, a lot of anger, denial, bargaining, and a lot of drama.
Yeah.
And we warn clients, we get them through that, but it's to be expected. This is a hard topic and there's a lot of nuance in here, and having that third party view really does help.
So I want to bridge the gap between you and Matt, both Matts, is that, so you as a C3PO, putting on your authorized C3PO hat, which of course is phenomenal. You were one of the very first, and the kill rate, I'm sorry, that's the Ranger in me. The non-pass rate was really high. It's about, I think the last, they're well over 300 going through the process and not making it through and getting referred back to the line. And that's only, we've only got 30 something, Matt, I think, Matt Travis, 38 or something like that.
35, but not all of the applicants have gone to the DIBCAC yet. So
yeah. So we've got about a 1% so far, between probably a little less than that if you consider all the candidates that went through the initial screening. So putting on your C3PO hat, when you talk about evidence sufficiency, and then bridge it over to Matt Travis about the cap, right? Matt Travis isn't making this standard up about what's sufficient evidence to meet the requirements. As an authorized C3PO, where are you getting that cue from about what constitutes sufficient evidence? The DCMA talked about when they went on the AB's town hall meeting. We're talking about some of the results where people were reporting, wow, I've got a 110 score. And then when they were audited, they had a negative, 100, right?
Right.
So let's talk about evidence sufficiency and then bridge that back to the cap.
So let's use an easy one. Let's talk the notice and consent banner.
Right.
This is the example I use all the time, so I can just pop this one off. So the first assessment objective is identify what that language is in simple terms. You need to be able to identify it, put that in policy, documented, organization defined parameter, it's been approved via your CMB, et cetera. You should be able to point me to that and provide that to me. You can have more than one, et cetera. The second assessment objective is fundamentally, have you implemented?
Right.
Now we're back to that AO to component level. Have you implemented on all of your Windows 10s? Yes, there's going to be some that just don't do things right, and that's a configuration issue. That's not a ding. We just find others. Have you implemented on your servers? Have you, Azure. Have you implemented your GCC high tenant? Can you show me across all of those applicable components you've done your job? Again, do you have enough of the right evidence? And that is it, so it matches at that level.
Okay, so let's review that really quick. So I need a policy that's very detailed that tells me what I'm supposed to do with regard to in your example, the banners, right? Well, maybe it's on my access control policy. So it's not necessarily a standalone thing. And it says, okay, look, every authorized device is going to have a banner on it. It's going to say these things, whether I'm remote or whether I'm inside my environment or whether it's a server or whatever it is. Everyone will have that banner. It's going to tell me who's responsible for that, right?
Mhm.
And then maybe there's a procedure for implementation. Maybe that procedure covers it with many other things that are going to be implemented,
Yep.
right? Yeah.
And then the only other thing to worry about is CNC machines, devices that are in scope that you can't do it.
Right.
Oh, this device we can't. Well, we printed it out on a nice long thing. And then we, taped it to the monitor itself. It's physically attached. Okay, and here's a picture of it. All right, good.
Love that. It's just simple,
sim-
right? It doesn't have to be uber complicated.
Right. And fundamentally, as an authorized C3PO, when we're coming in to assess you, Michael Redmond from Shellman, he told me this is like, oh, that's a brilliant way to phrase it. We are coming in to validate your story of your implementation of 800.171. That's all we're there for.
I love that. And Mike's actually, he's attending the meeting right now. So kudos to Mike Redmond because he's awesome at Shellman. Okay, so let's bridge that over, Matt, really quick to talk about the CAP, right? So the CAP is the thing that you're telling is the process document that's telling the organizations, authorized C3POs, this is how you'll conduct an assessment, and this is what you'll accept or won't accept, related to the requirements. So explain about what the CAP does, and then how that impacts. I'm implementing 171. I want to pass ultimately what the assessor wants me to do, right, and meet the requirements. And then how do I know what the assessor's what that process looks like and what the assessor is going to do and isn't going to do during the assessment process?
Yeah, Reagan, when you think about CMMC, I like to think about the doctrinal library that formulates how CMMC is implemented. It all starts with NIST 871, which is the standard, right? That's the standard. And then the DoD assessment guide is what tells assessors how to assess the implementation of the practices from that standard. The DoD scoping guide tells the DIB company, the OSC, how to bound its environment in terms of what's going to be in the scope of the assessment. The CAP, the CMMC assessment process, is the one document that comes from the AB, not from DoD, and that gives that procedural guide to how an assessment should be conducted. Because from our position as the accreditation body, we want to ensure that there is consistency, and partiality, and that there is uniformity across from the West Coast to East Coast, large DIB companies, small DIB companies. When you get a CMMC assessment, you should expect things to proceed in a consistent manner. So I should say that the CAP is still in draft form. It won't be final until after rulemaking is completed, but it gives those assessors the sequencing of how the engagement should initiate, the kind of questions you're going to ask in that pre-assessment phase. And also will give guidance on how to adjudicate POAMs and some of the other things that maybe are not explicitly articulated in an assessment guide or the scoping guide. So it's part of the official canon, and it's geared to really help the C3POs understand what's expected of them as part of their accreditation. So we talk about, for example, Matt's C3PO, eventually he's authorized now. He'll eventually have to become accredited, and that accreditation involves an audit and a site visit to make sure that any C3PO is conducting the assessments per all of the doctrine and authorities that are a part of CMMC.
Okay. All right. That makes perfect sense. All right. Lastly, I want to touch on with regard to sort of this setup and this relationship between, where we are now, which is DFARS 7012, 7019, 7020, and the upcoming CMMC rule and the authorities related to that with the accreditation body. And then one final piece I want to touch on is Matt, if I am an OSC, an organization that eventually I'm expecting to be required certification, right? But I know that DFARS 7012 impacts me now, just like you said, and 7019 and 7020 also impact me because that's probably in my my terms, reps and certs, or in my contract language. I may or may not even know it's there. And so where do I look to with regard to the assessment methodology on how to sort of step-by-step implement the requirements and then be able to build that catalog of appropriate documentation and appropriate evidence related to proving that my SPRS score is real. It's not just vaporware or sort of, a bunch of mulligans taped together and then thrown into SPRS to just to get the contract.
Which Matt?
No,
Which
I'm
Matt
sorry,
T?
Titcombe. Yeah, sorry. I'm looking at Matt, so obviously it's you.
My answer is heretical. Throw away the CMMC documentation.
Okay.
Go back to 800-171. You're required to implement 800-171.
Okay.
Follow NIST 800-171, paragraph 1.1. That defines your scope of applicability.
Okay.
Then sister document to that is 171 alpha. That's for all the assessment objectives. It's really when, we did the initial creation of the CMMC assessment guide, it was pretty much copy and paste. And it's been enhanced with stuff that we help to provide, the additional discussion, things like that, to add some stuff to clarify. But in reality, everybody has to implement 800-171, and all attestations have to be done in accordance with 800-171 alpha. DoD has to follow that rule too. So all the scoping guide is just scoping where me as an assessor comes in and looks.
Okay.
Now, once you've got your implementation done and you've got everything ready, now make sure you've got everything properly documented. You've broken up your components into different asset categories. And then for your specialized assets or contractor risk managed assets, make sure you've got justifications why they're in there, and then be ready to, especially in specialized assets, because I'm looking at your SSP and your kind of other related set of documents, how you've actually implemented 800-171 for those, because that's the core requirement there.
All right. So I want to pull on something between both of you, between an important relationship, right? So the CMMC assessment guide assumes, whether that I have read and understand 171, because that's the very first requirement underneath DFARS 7012. And it also, the CMMC assessment guide assumes that I've completed DFARS 7012 and 171, and I understand what 171 alpha is as well. So can you explain that the front parts in 171 and 171 alpha that are important for me to know, because those are that's the federal standard, and then bridging over, I've met those requirements, I understand them now. I've got this certification coming out, and then now I really need to understand the nuts and bolts of the third-party certification and the differences between those three.
So at the core, realistically, they are meshed like this. The 311 in NIST 800-171 has got 6 assessment objectives. It's really scary that I remember that number, but then in CMMC it's AC-L1. So they've just kind of added a little bit of nomenclature in the front, but in reality they are a one-to-one relationship.
Okay.
So as you go through that process of implementing 800-171, gathering all of that information, all that documentation and readiness, do that as a part of your normal configuration change management processes, et cetera. Build it as you go. And then as you maintain, it's really easy then to say, here's all of our stuff that we use. Tools like Future Feed, et cetera, they help to facilitate this. It's still a lot of work. That then translates over then, and this is really where the CMMC assessment process comes in. In that first phase, as a C3PO, we're working with you as an OSC to help to make sure you've properly categorized all your components and make sure we've defined, you've got your implementation boundary, but really that certification boundary, and that we're all in agreement on that certification boundary before we start your formal conformity assessment.
Okay. All right. So how valuable is, before I get to the CMC certification part, how valuable is 171 alpha to me, the assessment from the assessment sort of sister, if you will, to 171?
To me, 171 alpha versus the CMMC assessment guide is, they're equals. The assessment guide basically adds some additional context and information that's it's quasi-authoritative for interpretation. When I'm working with these, I've either got 171 alpha open for clients, or I've got the assessment guide, depending upon where I'm at with the client, what we're doing in that. So to me, they're kind of equal pairing. You can use either one to get ready at that point when you're in that level of detail.
All right, perfect. All right. So we're going to turn our attention now to talking about controlled and classified information, because there's a lot of confusion out there. And so let's start with Matt. So I've had people, be confused on when we're going for CMMC certification. How does this relationship to controlled and classified information? And so for the purpose of the CMC rule, what is that relationship to controlled and classified information, Matt? Travis.
Yes, it's important to recognize that the whole reason for existence of CMMC is to protect CUI and FCI. And I think there's still some confusion. Does this involve classified information? No. This is only unclassified information under the controlled unclassified information umbrella, which you've been following. It has been confusing for the casual observer. We went FOUO and SPU, a lot of terminology changes. It's all trying to consolidate now under the CUI, and actually above that FCI. And actually, so CMMC is geared to protect not only controlled unclassified information, but federal contract information. Again, without getting too arcane, you can go to NARA's website to get a deeper dive, go to 48 CFR, but essentially FCI is the bigger circle in the Venn diagram, and CUI is a smaller circle within FCI. So all CUI is FCI, but not all FCI is necessarily CUI. I'll leave it at that. But the reason why that's so important, you think, well, this is not classified stuff. Why are we so concerned about it? That's where our cyber threat actors have been eating our lunch over the past several years, because it's so much easier to penetrate the civilian supply chain within the industrial base than it is to compromise a .mil network. And so I saw this prior to getting involved in CMMC. I was over at CISA and would see this every day in the intel reporting in terms of cyber threat actors. The threat landscape out there is going to go for the weakest link, and the weakest link is generally going to be those businesses that have not implemented basic cyber hygiene, but yet, as being part of the DIB or other critical infrastructure industrial bases, possess a lot of valuable information that is unclassified and resident in federal contracts. And that is how China, the most prominent example, has been gleaning so much very valuable information that they've used to shape their own industrial base for their military. So it's of utmost importance that CMMC is a success, but it's less about the bigger program, Regan, as you all know. It's literally company by company. If you're going to walk the walk, or you're going to talk the talk about being part of the DIB, you need to walk the walk and protect that CUI and FCI, and that's what CMMC is all about.
Yeah, I could not agree more. So to clarify, if I have controlled technical information, and obviously as a defense industrial based company, I have to learn what that means, right? But assuming I know what that means, well, then there's other types of technical data, technical information underneath the ITAR, export controlled information. So is that included within the realm of CMMC as well?
Yeah, it is. And it's important to understand some of the subsets, right? So that's two different types of CUI. There's basic CUI and specified CUI. They're both involved. They're both come under CMMC. One of the challenges, Regan, I think if I had to put my finger on what's probably one of the bigger points of confusion in CMMC is that there isn't there's not consistency in terms of how CUI is marked and labeled from government contracting officers. And so it causes a lot of confusion. Do I even have it? How do I know how to look for it? So there's a couple references. DOD-CUI.mil is a website that will kind of walk you through. Each department in the federal government's got to have a CUI registry that tells, here are the types of information that is CUI to us. And while it's still the responsibility of them to market, as you know, Regan, if it's on your network, you have the responsibility to know if it's on your network, whether it's marked or not. So you best understand, how CUI is defined within each department, especially DoD.
Yeah, in my experience with my clients, I've seen basically what the primes are doing, and it's probably appropriate because there's so many programs and so many moving pieces that they're basically saying in their terms, reps and certs and terms, that this is the general description about what we consider CUI. And then they basically give the definitions related to technical data and technical information, back word for word. And then, aerospace and defense purposes, and any information that we exchange with you, or whether or not you created in performance of your contract, we consider, CUI then they leave the specified categories, whether or not it's controlled technical information or ITAR related information or EAR. And what I've seen is that most of your average companies have no idea that this is buried in their terms and in their reps and certs. And so they're just assuming, well, we're receiving this information, and since it's not marked, I don't have any responsibilities here. And of course, based on that contract language, that nothing could be further from the truth. And of course, also based on 32 CFR and requirements, unmarked CUI information that qualifies as CUI that is unmarked is CUI by definition. So let's talk about Matt in thinking about sort of bridging this when we're doing a security control assessment for a DoD assessment methodology or just implementing the requirements, right? And we want to do the risk assessment. We want to do the security assessment, which is required underneath the NIST 800-171 requirements. Am I responsible for marking CUI when I develop it? And of course, in relationship to the contract when I receive it, am I responsible for either handling it appropriately or reaching out to the prime contractor or my higher tier subcontractor to clarify, is this CUI or isn't there CUI? So what's been your experience in relationship to working with your clients as consultant and so forth?
So let's break that down into 3 use cases. So when you're receiving properly marked or generating derivative CUI within your environment, absolutely, you are supposed to mark it not only in accordance with the NARA guidance, but you're supposed to mark it in accordance with DoD Instruction 5248, which is actually more restrictive.
Yeah,
little nuance. It's nothing major. They require a footer versus where a header is mandatory for NARA. So again, but you have to follow that guidance. And again, we're going to make sure you're doing it on a sample. We're not going to go chase anything and everything. We're not going to actually validate that, oh, you've actually properly classified, what is CUI, not CUI. That's a little bit out of our scope for where we start getting into trouble as a C3PAO. Now, there's 2 other use cases we have to deal with. And here's, well, what happens when you inadvertently leak CUI that should have been protected as CUI? That's an incident response. And then there's kind of that related incident response that you alluded to. Hey, I've received something from a contractor or DoD that appears to be CUI, but it's not properly marked. Again, this is now your requirement is be careful about overmarking because you may not be qualified. You may not have the rights. Protect it as if it's CUI. Absolutely. But then go back up to that prime. And so we will look for those latter 2 procedures for how you handle those instances, but then we're really going to look for, are you properly marking and handling? Now, when we come to the physical on-site inspections, if you do have CUI on site, we will be looking at your physical controls. Where are you physically securing CUI? If you can't use encrypted USB, but you're moving information around USB sticks, we're going to want to see how you're actually protecting those USB sticks during that movement and then when they're not in use. So yeah, it can get pretty interesting when it comes to the physical reviews.
Okay. I think that's I think that's really good. So that means that I'm the full scale, the CUI life cycle I'm responsible for. So that includes destruction, that includes sharing, right? Making sure that, because I've got subcontractors that I outsource things to, right? And so I need to make sure that CUI is properly marked, regardless when I'm sharing it downstream.
Right. And so if we go all the way, I think it's AC 313, control the flow of CUI. It's acceptable for us as C3PO to say, hey, you've got DFARS 7012 in your clause, you've awarded the subcontract. Have you validated that these people have actually got an SSP and submitted an SS? We're not going to go validate them. That's out of scope. Have you done your due diligence before you gave it to them and their external information system? Okay, great. Thank you. We're going to move on. So you've got to do all those things in preparation, making sure you're properly marking, controlling, and sharing information. And then also don't forget your MSPs and MSSPs who have access to it. Are you also making sure that because you've extended your IT and you are responsible, not them, for making sure they're also following your CUI management practices and access practice requirements on that one.
Okay, that is a really good point. We've got an upcoming CMC War Room that'll be with Richard Wakeman and a few others talking about, third parties, right? So my managed service provider, how are they implicated? And of course, Matt's touched on that on the original draft of the working draft underneath the CAP diagram, which reflects, of course, DoD policy and DFARS 7012. But this upcoming CMC War Room webinar, we're going to dive deep into that. What are the implications from my ERP? My other cloud service providers that I'm using their SaaSes. I'm using let's say a cloud-based engineering program to develop CUI. What are the implications with that, right?
Just talk Adobe Cloud.
Yeah,
I've got Adobe Acrobat on my desktop, and I've got the Adobe Cloud. Can I use it?
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we're definitely gonna talk about that because that's a very lengthy subject, but it's very important, right? Because ultimately, if I haven't met DFARS 7012 requirements, then how can I certify? If I'm not protecting CUI when I share it, how can I certify, right? Because ultimately, this is about the protection of, as Matt said, the protection of controlled and classified information and federal contract information. Okay, Matt, let's go back to you on the FCI piece. I want to tease on that a little bit. So the folks out there who think that they only have federal contract information, they don't think that they have CUI. Are you going to be able to offer, like, let's say I want Matt at Peak InfoSec to do a certification of me or do an assessment of me. Are you going to allow for me to sort of exemplify myself or sort of stand above my peers in a competitive environment to be able to certify me eventually for being level 1, even though I just have FCI?
Well, no, if I understand the question. So as the accreditation body, our primary role is to accredit, authorize and accredit the C3POs. Right now, because CMMC is still building up, we play probably a broader role than we eventually will in terms of helping share information, hold town halls, and help answer a lot of questions about CMMC and facilitate better understanding of what this is all about. But when it comes to, if you're a company and wondering, do I have FCI or CUI? For one, and we've got a great practitioner community within the ecosystem of registered practitioners and registered practitioner organizations who are there. You can find them on the marketplace at CyberAB. They're the real experts to help you figure out what you've got, how to identify and understand the information within your environment. I'll also cite those other references that the government has, both within NARA as well as with the DoD CUI page. And if you want to go read the definition of what FCI is, you can go to 48 CFR, what have you. So, but if I don't think I just fully understood the question.
So what I meant was, is a C3PO like Matt, are they going to be able to certify me for level 1? Is that in the works or not yet?
So when I got you now, Regan. When CMMC 2.0 came out, level 1, which used to be a third-party certification level within the framework, was reverted to a self-attestation. And this was part of the effort that the department had to try to alleviate some of the cost burden of small businesses who may only have FCI in their environment. So, it's all through a risk managed lens. And so I understand where the department was coming from, because FCI, general FCI, is not as important as CUI. So let's lower the threshold for validating that and make it a self-attestation. However, the department verbally allowed those level 1 companies to go ahead and get certified. It won't, because I think there's probably a reason that some businesses are going to want to get certified by a third party and not just self-attest.
Right.
You're still going to have to go into the SPRS and enter in your level 1 data, but I think it's an added measure for your business partners, suppliers, your employees, your boards of directors, your ownership, that, hey, we actually had a C3PO certified as level 1. We're still working through the CAICO, what those certification parameters would be, but that's in the mix, and we look forward to offering that once CMMC goes live. Okay,
so last question, then we're going to talk about CUI, Matt, Titcombe. So it's been my experience that our clients have won big in going back once they've gotten through and met the minimum requirements. They have all the documentation, appropriate documentation. They're working on building their evidence, and they're working on implementing the rest of the requirements, that they come out big, that they can actually differentiate themselves in the marketplace by saying, hey, look, we take this seriously, and we are legitimately on our way to fully meeting requirements, and obviously with an eye on CMMC. Have you seen that same thing, Matt, where people are bringing home the bacon at once they've taken the requirements seriously and really begin to build competence and capture confidence of their customers?
Me or that, Matt?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Matt Titcombe. Yes.
So the answer is yes. We're seeing the same thing. We've seen a lot of companies grow. We're also seeing companies that after we've gotten them started, next thing you know, hey, we're done with you. We're being acquired by, pick your big name brand company, because there's a lot of that going, because they're starting to consolidate and protect their supply chain. The other part of this we're seeing now with the potential rule issues that Matt spoke about earlier is both an increased interest in the joint voluntary surveillance assessments, which is where we're kind of deputized DIBCAC auditors, and the more informal and non-certified, non-validated results of a C3PO coming in doing a mock assessment, and then them using that letter of the results of that going back up their chain and saying to their prime, hey, we had such and such come in, and this is the result of what they found in a mock assessment, and using that to help to grow and build their business. I definitely think with the pressure and then the people that are kind of waiting, and are going to be kind of moved to the front of the bus, if you're moving forward and you're getting 800-171 done now, you're going to get a lot more work in the next 2 years.
Yeah, we're seeing an average of 40 to 60% top line revenue growth for our clients, who basically, once they get through the documentation and they're aggressive and they're on their way, they pivot right back to their DoD contracting officers or their higher tier subs, right? And say, hey, look, give us your business because we're doing this the right way. And if our competitors aren't, give us more work. And that's really a winning strategy. Last thing that Rick Rosenberry, who's done an outstanding, happen to know him, outstanding cyber insurance agent, he asked a question, which I think is a good one when we're talking about CUI, and that the penalties are not the same for different categories of CUI. Like ITAR is a 28-year, very, very aggressive and very punitive enforcement regime. And I've seen companies literally get, $50, $100 million fines, and it would be very, very ugly if they are found in violation of the ITAR or export control and not managing their requirements appropriately. And then I've seen, of course, we've had False Claims Act that we know about, some that have been settled out of the public eye, and for controlled technical information and non-ITAR related penalties. I mean, do you guys get a sense that that the sort of the bad man is coming, that enforcement is really on its way with regard to SPRS and with regard to 7012 before we even get to CMMC?
I'll jump in here, Reagan. I think it is. Again, I take my guidance from some of the attorneys whose full-time job is to keep an eye on the legal implications of CMMC and the DFARS clauses. And I do think you're seeing a little more activity on the government side, both in terms of what they're saying, and even there's been a couple of cases now, some from Iraq, and it might have been more HIPAA related breaches, but nonetheless, cybersecurity conformancy are in play. That yes, False Claims Act and other measures of enforcing and spot checking this are going to be forthcoming. But when it comes to CMMC, I think it's important for your audience to know that this is an award requirement. So you won't even be able to get in the door and win a contract if you don't have CMMC certification. Yes, it will be the validity, at least my understanding the current rule, there'll be 3 years. So you get your certification, you're now eligible to bid on DoD contracts that have the CMMC requirement. And then you're going to be required annually to attest that you're still maintaining those standards of CMMC within your environment. but you can't even play in DoD contracting eventually if you don't get certified, and that's probably the biggest penalty of all.
In the bigger picture of things, I mean, we're waiting on the president's new cybersecurity requirements executive order, and that will aggressively expand. My understanding is NIST 171 across almost all federal contracts. In some of the draft language and discussions that I had heard. Have you heard the same thing, Matt, or either Matt?
It's the National Cybersecurity Strategy, which I think is what we're all looking for probably next week or the week after. And
That's
by
right.
all accounts, a much firmer regulatory disposition from the federal government is what we're anticipating. To date, the federal government's been much more of encouraging preparedness and capacity building and standards. I think that the time is come where that patience has run out on the federal side, and using a more regulatory approach is probably where this is all going. So, I mean, listen, I've said this before, we certainly believe it, that you won't even think twice about the need to get a third party validation of your cybersecurity practices to conduct business, not only with government, but within even the commercial sector. When you think about where the world's going with 5G or with AI and quantum and 5G IoT, managing digital risk is becoming more and more paramount, and you can't just take someone's word for it. You can't just take a self-attestation word for it. It's going to be that third party certification. CMMC is kind of blazing the trail on this, but I think you'll see it pervasive throughout all sectors of commerce in the years to come.
Okay, Matt. So and I agree with you 100%. Thanks for clarifying that. I've forgotten for some reason I blanked on the name of that. So, Matt, let's talk about CUICon next week. Tell us about CUICon. What's on the agenda? What's the purpose of CUICon, and what can we expect?
So CUICon is very much the same purpose as the CMMC War Room. Went to a bunch of conferences last year and kind of went, we're all talking nerd geek, CMMC speak to just ourselves, and not a lot of organizations that need to get into compliance. So working with Fernando Machado from CyberSec Investments, also another authorized C3PAO. And we're hosting CUICon. It's actually going to be in the Space Coast, just south of Kennedy Space Center, Patrick Space Command, whatever they call it now. Still Air Force Base to me. I'm ex-Air Force. So we're trying to reach to a community, and we've specifically not marketed in CMMC land. We're marketing out to manufacturing, engineering, satellite firms, all the people that are doing actual generation of CUI and have to protect that government's intellectual property. We've got Buddy Dees, the CMMC program director. He's going to be one of our keynote speakers. And our other keynote speaker is going to be William Spence from DIBCAC. He's going to be providing us, between the two of them, is what's happening and the why we're doing this. And then with William coming in afterwards and then saying, here's what we're seeing when we're coming in and auditing of what's not getting done. But the fundamental premise, we're breaking into 3 blocks. Why do you need to do this? How do you do this in general, kind of getting yourself situated? And then the Friday session is really set up about how do you go implement. Now we end on noon on Friday because guess what? Orlando's and Walt Disney World's 45 minutes away, 20 minutes up the road is Port Canaveral if you want to go on a cruise. Again, we're trying to also make this an opportunity for all of us in the CMMC community, as we're getting ready for all this, to also take a break and have a little bit of fun somehow.
Awesome. Well, listen, that actually sounds very exciting. We are very fortunate, to have, honestly, Matt Travis and you really in the trenches. Fernando has been in the trenches for as long as you and I have been. I wanted to touch on something real quick before we wrap up. Our esteemed colleague, Bob Metzger, which you guys know I have so much admiration for. He has a comment and a question. He said, ITAR regime has been around for a long time, and it has a separate statutory regulatory enforcement regime. Certainly does. And I would not assume we'll see counterparts to CMC unless there's a regulatory basis to do so. I agree with Bob in the sense that under DoD policy, ITAR and other categories of CUI have to meet CUI the DoD policy first, DFARS 7012, and then the expectation is, of course, CMMC. And ITAR is responsible. DTC and the State Department are responsible for enforcement of ITAR. But I think that and I fully concur with that. And but the reality is ultimately is ITAR is a very punitive regime, and ultimately, you know, DoD says by policy you have to follow the ITAR rules and our rules as well.
Yep.
So,
It is.
Yeah, go ahead.
It is ITAR data, otherwise CUI export or CUI export research and development.
Yep.
When you're handling that under the DoD contract, you're now subject to double jeopardy.
Yep.
You can be pursued for lack of cybersecurity underneath, you know, False Claims Act for 800-171 implementation. And now, like you said, everybody else can come after your business underneath ITAR. And yeah, so be very careful. And our default recommendation is if you think it's, and you potentially going to be handling any ITAR export controlled data, go ahead and be most conservative in your approach.
Yeah, I agree with that. And Bob is going to be with Katie in Arrington in June to talk about the CMC rule and the language. So that's coming up in CMC War Room 5. And John Ellis, if schedule permits, may also attend that as well. So that's an exciting series that we will see on June 22nd, I believe, at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So we look forward to Robert Metzger and Katie Arrington and potentially John Ellis to join that discussion. The last couple of things I want to talk about in relationship to what this series is that training education is very important to me. And we are very grateful for TMAC and Cross Timbers PTAC, Texas MEP, CUI Supply, SMU, Southern Methodist University, and Future Feed and Georgia Tech on the MEP for reaching out beyond the ecosystem to really get and access the people who really need to hear this information as sponsors. And of course, CMC Industry Standards Council, which Matt Titcombe is a part of that, and Fernando Machado as well. And then also we want to talk about the fact that there's an upcoming CMC Certified Professional course through Southern Methodist University that yours truly will be the instructor for from February 27th through May 2nd. So if you're interested in that, and ultimately this really boils down to this ecosystem coming together and us continue to iron sharpens iron, as Matt and I have both Matts actually have experienced over the last 3 years and two years with Matt Travis, and working together and really owning the fine details of these requirements and helping organizations really navigate our way through this. So my heartfelt thanks for Matt Travis joining us and Matt Titcombe joining us in kicking off CMC War Room #1. And we look forward to really engaging this in, and really, please don't hesitate to reach out to me through LinkedIn or through email and saying, hey, Regan, this would be really important to talk about. And so that we can continue to stay close to not just the things that the ecosystem cares about, but we're really what those organizations out there really doing it and really struggling with the challenges that face us, both from a keeping their pulse on the issues, but also from a training education standpoint through CMC Mythbusters. So thank you very much for joining us on our inaugural CMC War Room. Thank you, Matt, and both Matts. And we look forward to great things up ahead starting in February 28th with CMC Mythbusters series.
Thanks, Regan.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Goodbye, everyone, and look forward to next time.